I'm Catherine Reid, host of the St. Paul Forum, and coming up next, I'm speaking with Ann Manning of Future First Congress. That's coming up next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm Catherine Reid, and joining me today is Ann Manning of the Future First Congress. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. I want to know the idea and the passion for this Future First Women's Congress that happened last fall. Where did it come from for you?
Well, a friend that I know who's very active in the environmental groups nationally called me one day in 2012 and said, there's a Women's Congress for Future Generations taking place in Moab, Utah. And so we decided to go. And when I got there, I was so struck by the concepts and ideas that were emerging, that particularly as women's voices get heard more in the mainstream, that there are lots of new ideas and ways to move forward to protect the planet for future generations. And I think women have a special interest in creating a healthy planet to leave to future generations. And as we all know, with climate change, it's happening to those who are here now. And when I was talking with the founder of the Women's Congress, her name is Carolyn Raffensperger. She is our country's leading expert on the rights of future generations, an environmental attorney. I realized she lived in Ames, Iowa. And I thought, oh, this is a Twin Cities event.
We can make this happen here.
Yes.
Let's talk just briefly about the concept of this future generations, the first two words, future first. It really comes from a very ancient set of values.
Yes.
Is that right? Can you talk a little bit about where that comes from?
Yes. There is, of course, the Native Americans who talk about the 7 generations, that no major decisions, if you think about what's happening in our state, pipelines, transporting oil by rail, fracking, the silica sand mining on the bluffs of the Mississippi. We need to be thinking about the 7th generation and using what Carolyn and others call the precautionary principle. Do we know enough to go forward? Because if we don't, then we should stop until we have done our homework, done the research, and know that we are not putting current and future generations at risk. And that's where it comes from.
So this idea that take this precaution and think through things. So this sort of deliberation, how does that actually look when it comes to, we have a very limited amount of time for our legislators to meet right now. They're in session.
Right.
How, as you think through some of the kind of questions like the Sandpiper pipeline, for example, which is under discussion right now, that affects Minnesota and the headwaters of the Mississippi. How do you look at it when you think about the Future First Women's Congress? Yes.
Well, one of the things that we have done is we have really created a network of allies. So groups like Honor the Earth, Minnesota 350, who's very involved, Interfaith Power and Interfaith Power and Light. Many organizations in the upper Midwest that are working on these issues. And one of the ways we work together is to help legislators and people like public utilities commissioners understand that if you run a pipeline too close to the lakes where our wild rice is grown, or to where we all want that whitefish, right? We love that. And those are our natural resources that we've had for generations. And if we run a pipeline too close to that water, or perhaps anywhere near that water, we won't have those. We can pollute those waters for generations and generations to come. And so asking our legislators to think carefully, and one of the concepts that we use is something called free, prior, and informed consent. And that's a very important word or concept, that we must have we shouldn't have to raise $2 million to get the research on whether it's safe. That's not something public citizens should have to go do bake sales for. That should be part of the process. It needs to happen prior to putting in a pipeline, not 5 years later when there's a spill and it's like, oh, guess we didn't mean to do that. And so one of the things that I learned was the Royal Bank of Canada a couple of years ago said they would no longer fund developers of the tar sands in Canada without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous people who live there. That, to me, was a major turning point, and when I began to understand the power of these ideas. So part of what we can do this legislative session is to help our legislators understand concepts like that.
That's really big. Now, you had this idea at the Moab event.
Right.
You then pulled together a team and you
Yes.
hosted a very large event.
Yes, almost 500 people came.
In November. It was not simply local people, it was people from around the region. And you did a lot of informing there.
We did,
Yeah.
yes.
Now, tell us briefly what is kind of coming up, what has now come from that, because obviously the people watching this
Absolutely.
can't attend something that happened in the past, but this
Right.
is something you're saying we're launching something now.
Absolutely. And as Carolyn has said to me a few times, and I really believe her, is that great ideas and great events change history. So if you think of the March on Washington, I wasn't there, but I've been active in those issues. And when you think about Seneca Falls, you and I weren't even alive. But we know the women's movement and the power of that.
The women's movement is
Seneca
said to have
Falls,
launched
at Seneca Falls.
Yeah.
Yes. And so we see that as a launch event and invite all of your viewers to join us now. We do have monthly gatherings that we can talk about later that they can find on our website, futurefirst.us. But we also are planning now to really sit down with our allies and say, how do we strategize what's happening in the upper Midwest? We need to work on each individual issue, but we need an overarching strategy. Maybe it's a constitutional amendment, state by state, that protects the rights of future generations. Maybe it's educating our legislators about how the precautionary principle and free, prior, and informed consent work. There are many directions, and we will be meeting over the next few months, and we invite people to come and join the conversation, because this is launching a new phase of the movement. The movement is out there. It's bubbling everywhere.
Great. If you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Ann Manning, who's responsible for the Future First Women's Congress. We just have a couple more minutes because what we want to do is entice people to look at the activities, think about how they can get engaged. But we also had a guest, Mary Pipher, whom I had a chance to interview. One of the things I loved about Mary's speech at the event and the short interview that we have for the audience now is that she helped us overcome our dispiritedness.
Yes.
How do you think about that, and what message would you like to relay about that? Because these things seem really large to people.
They're big and they're daunting. But what I have found is the more I get out there and meet people who are interested in working on the issue, the more my spirits go up. That linking arms, working together, and there are so many places to work. As we say, part of our work is to help you find your place in the movement, because some people want to go march. Some people are like, never doing that. That's fine. There are so many ways to get involved. And that's one of the core purposes of the Future First Women's Organization, is to help individuals who haven't really found their niche yet to come and learn with others. And then it may be taking a step to write a letter to the editor. It may be going to a pipeline meeting. It may be a protest. It may be joining your own faith community and looking at what your church can do, or synagogue or congregation of any type, to look at how can you green your own buildings? How are you thinking about caring for creation? There's so many ways to get involved in this movement.
One of the things I loved about the event was how much care you took to nurture our emotional spirits. It was very spiritually based, very engaged and broad. And that was another thing I loved about Mary, was that she also had a sort of playfulness to it, a sense of hospitality. She talked about baking pies to give in advance to the governor, saying, I know you'll vote right on this, but here's the pie to thank you. let's talk just briefly. We want to encourage people to go to your website and look at the upcoming events that are happening yet this in both January and February.
Right.
It has a sense of hospitality to it. Is that
It
part
does.
of what you're
Yeah.
communicating?
And I would say it's a welcoming space for people of all faiths and no faith. That it is spirit-filled, but not in a way that I don't
Not
think
exclusionary.
No, not in any way. And would you like to hear about a few of our events coming up?
Yeah, let's just talk briefly about those.
We do a potluck every month, and so you can sign up on our website. And on January 31st, we're partnering with Northland Sustainable Solutions, who was a sponsor of Bioneers here in the Upper Midwest for a number of years and still connected to them, and the Pachamama Alliance, local Minnesota group, and the Future First Women's Congress. And we're doing a Saturday afternoon event where they're showing 3 different movie or keynote or speeches of the Bioneers Conference this last fall. And they'll be wonderful. I think it's Naomi Klein, Eve Ensler.
Yeah, it's a stellar lineup.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And a great place to meet people in a very non-threatening environment. Bring your popcorn. No, I'm kidding. We'll have something there. And then on February 17th, I really encourage people to go online at honortheearth.org. We are also helping to co-sponsor an event at the Women's Club in Minneapolis. Eve Ensler of the Vagina Dialogues will be here in conversation with Winona LaDuke and Louise Erdrich, 2 of our local heroines, to talk about extraction and the impact of violence against women, against Native women with all of these extraction industries. I think it'll be a fascinating evening, and that's February 17th.
Well, we will put all those on the website.
Great.
Thank you, Ann Manning, for joining us. That's all we have time for, but stay to watch the brief interview with Mary Pipher. Welcome to the SPNN Forum. I'm Catherine Reid Day, and joining me today is author and activist Mary Pipher. Mary, I am so honored to have you here. Tell us briefly, you're in town for the Women's Congress, and could you just talk about what attracted you to come as a speaker to this particular conference?
Well, first of all, I'm very concerned, like many people are, about doing everything I can to preserve our biosphere for future generations, and that's what this Congress is about. I also was very attracted to the idea of women activists from all over the world, including from this morning I heard from someone working in Ecuador and someone working in Bolivia. And I'm very interested in what's happening everywhere in the world. So that was a big draw. I also really like the idea that women's voices would be focused on at this conference. My own experience is many of the leaders of the environmental movement worldwide are women. And so I thought it was a great idea to give them a special showcase for their voices.
And I'd like to follow up on that in terms of what difference women can make around any kind of movement. How do you see that? What do you think is different about why it is women taking that lead and what difference they can make in particular?
Well, first of all, I think women are especially prone to like the environmental movement because we're nurturers, we take care of children, we take care of grandchildren. We have a real investment in the well-being of our families. Now, example of that, you know how they say if you're going to give money to poor people around the world, give it to the women, not the men, because the men will spend it on recklessly or on themselves, and the women will spend it on the children. If you substitute the word money for energy, women have an enormous amount of energy for nurturing and for working for the betterment and the well-being of families. Now, this is, of course, not to diss men. There's great men out there. All I'm saying is it's natural for women to be very engaged with this particular topic. So I think that's indeed part of it.
And as a larger change theory, which is really what I see your voice having been, I really see you as a change activist. Right. And I'd like to start by the first book I encountered is your beautiful work, Reviving Ophelia. Right. Could you tell us, it's about how to keep women and girls strong in part. It's very much about that voice. Did you see yourself as an activist when you were 9 or as you were growing up?
You know, of course I didn't. I didn't have that language. That language wasn't even in our culture, especially for girls in Beaver City, Nebraska. You know, but I did actually have impulses toward activism. And the two things I remember at that age were, after a rainstorm, I would go out and I would find any little animals that had washed into the street from their nests, like little squirrels or mice or birds. I would bring them home and try to rescue them. And I had little shoe boxes and little cloth with milk I could dip and feed them, you know, with a little milky cloth. And I took a real pleasure in being someone who tried to take care of animals in my town. And even though I was a very shy girl, if someone was going to abuse an animal around me, I would stand up for that animal. And sometimes I remember as a child amazing myself at how I would face big boys who were throwing rocks at a turtle or something and just stand in front of them and say, cut that out, you know. So that was a small kind of activism. The other thing was, my school, like I think all elementary schools in the world, had its share of mean-spiritedness and bullies. And one thing I remember was the germ game, where children would be picked as the one who had germs, and then other children wouldn't want to touch them for fear the germs rubbed off. And they were, basically, they were made pariahs by this game. And it was always the same poor children. You know, one boy had a salivary gland problem, and another pair of twins, their dad was a murderer in the pen. They're always the ones picked on, you know. And I remember deciding, when I was probably about 9, I would never pick on anybody. I didn't believe in it. And I didn't exactly stand up for them, but when the germs, if you touch someone like that, you'd pass the germs on, and then they'd have to pass them on. And when somebody'd pass them on to me, I'd just go, I don't believe in this. I'm not going to play this game. So I could always stop it when it got to me. So I had a sense, I think I got it from my reading, and I got it from my mother especially. I had a basic sense that life ought to be fair, and that living beings ought to be respected. And I got that from my family mostly.
Well, that is a very timely kind of idea, given our reaction to Ebola, and to be able to stand up and say, I'm not going to let something get in the way of my relationship here. You have been a therapist, you've been a prolific author, and one of the things you've really focused on is the idea that there are things we must face, and yet there needs to be fun and hope. And I heard that in a very brief context around the organizing you've done about in your state around the Keystone Pipeline.
Yeah,
Can you talk about, that's my brief interpretation, but I'd love to hear you talk from that perspective for us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just on the topic of climate science, most people that are at a conference like this do not need to be told that global climate change is occurring. Most of us who are interested in learning more already know that. And I'm not one to belabor a point. Now, when our group formed, I formed it with another guy, and then we got a lot more people engaged real quickly. But I felt compelled to form it after reading Bill McKibben's book, Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H, in which he basically says that life as we know it won't be over in our grandchildren's generation. It'll be over in the lives of middle-aged people. And I also realized that his scientific facts, his economic facts were just tragic. They were just almost unbearable. And so part of me, I've been this way since I was a very little girl, my antidote to despair is action. And so I felt compelled to act, of course I wanted to help the environment, but frankly, mainly I wanted to help myself. And I just knew if I got involved in doing something to protect the environment, I would be able to push my despair to the side and be happy again. And so I actually, in the Green Boat, do something very unusual in the environmental movement, which is I make a mental health argument for activism. And my basic premise is hope is not about outcome. Hope is about process. And you only feel hopeful if you're engaged in a hopeful process. Now, that being said, it's much more nuanced than that. For example, one of the common things that most community educators that do environmental work know now is you just don't tell people, oh my gosh, life is terrible, we're about to see the end of life as we know it, it's hopeless. That you have to kind of be careful how much bad news you present, and then present what you can do, and here's some bright things and so on. That's good. I think that's a very good model. I don't question it. On the other hand, it's also very important to allow people to grieve, to acknowledge that grieving, to talk honestly with them about the ways we all understandably try to protect ourselves from pain, and the fact that we do all come in and out of denial every day of our lives. But I'll tell you a really good example of this. In Nebraska, where I live, we just got whipped on Tuesday. Yeah. We had the best candidate for governor and the best Democratic candidate for senator we've had in my lifetime. And I've been in that state 67 years, almost. And the guy running for Senate was Atticus Finch. He was a man of brilliance, integrity, extraordinary skill. He has actually single-handedly right now, to a certain extent, stopped the KXL pipeline because he's an attorney representing the landowners against the state of Nebraska and TransCanada. And he's got it so tied up in the courts that even if President Obama wanted to approve the pipeline, there's still a big legal issue in Nebraska that the president can't get around. That's our Dave Domino, who ran for Senate. So anyway, Dave loses. Chuck, the guy running for governor, great guy, loses. Virtually all our candidates lose. And so we have a group meeting the next night, Wednesday night. Whole country has gone red. And I'm not one who thinks Republican, Democrat. I tend to organize around issues. But one of the implications is the people in charge of environmental and energy policy are going to be people who are very pro-coal, not particularly sympathetic to environmental issues at all. So for our group, it's very bad news. So we get together, we always have fun in our group, we always have pie, we always have potluck, you know, and wine, and we all get together, and I'm the leader, and I go, okay, let's just go around the room and everyone say what they want to say about this election. And the first three people said something positive. They go, like one guy goes, you know, folks, it's not all bad. And he pointed out a few races where we had actually won, or a good news piece here and there. Next person goes, yeah, and looking forward, and he starts to direct the group forward. Another person more or less the same. We're all good at being positive and moving forward into action. I mean, one thing I said at the beginning of the group is, we're going to plan an action tonight. We need it for our mental health. We're going to come out of this meeting with an action. But then the fourth guy who spoke, a guy named Dick, sitting in the corner drinking wine, he goes, well, here's how I feel about it. We're doomed. We're doomed. Just made a blank statement like that. Before he could go on, one of the more positive people immediately interrupts him, very reactive, very emotionally, goes, I can't think like that, I can't talk like that, and survive. Which, in a sense, revealed his own despair, that he couldn't even hear we're doomed without such a strong negative reaction. Well, then Dick felt interrupted, and these two men started to be engaged in a dialogue about, like Ken, the positive man, said, I have to believe that my actions make a difference. I have to be an actor in this. I have children and grandchildren. And Dick goes, well, I have grandchildren and children too, and I'm here tonight because I believe in action too. Feeling that I'm doomed and feeling that I'm passive are not the same thing. And that opened the room up to a discussion of the extraordinarily complicated set of emotions we all have right now. Because on one hand, we all carry this deep, deep grief that is unabated because it's reality. It is what it is. And on the other hand, some of us are by nature cheerful. Other people are by intellect, oriented to work hard. Many of us are by character structure, motivated to be good people doing the best we can. And so even at the same time we carry all this despair, we also carry a great deal of positive energy to make things better. And one thing that came out of the group that night was we ended up exactly where I knew we'd end up. We planned some actions. We talked about how important it was to be together and support each other through this very sad election time. But we also gave each other space to have every single human emotion. And I think that's very important in this process, that people are allowed to feel and express whatever feelings they have and to have those feelings validated. There aren't any inappropriate feelings about the environment and global climate change.
Well, you can see that Mary Pipher has a lot of wisdom, and I encourage you to look for her book, The Green Boat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate having you here.
It was lovely. Thank you.